She stood on the auction platform, wrapped in black from head to toe, her face completely hidden behind a heavy veil. The men in the crowd laughed and called her the mystery widow. No one would bid. Then a drunk cowboy made a cruel bet. $300 that the richest rancher in the territory could not make this scarecrow his wife by sunrise. Jacob Harlow took that bet. He paid $200 for a woman he had never seen. A woman hiding secrets that could destroy them both. What he did not know was that beneath that veil were scars from a fire that killed her husband and 7-year-old son. A fire set by one of the most powerful men in the country, a railroad baron who was still hunting her. When Clara finally removed her veil and showed Jacob her ruined face, she expected disgust. She expected to be thrown out like garbage. What happened next will shatter everything you think you know about love. Stay until the very end, because this story will prove that the deepest scars are not the ones you can see. This story teaches us that our scars, whether visible or hidden, do not define our worth. It reminds us that the people who truly love us will see past our wounds to the strength that created them. Sometimes the moments when we feel most broken are exactly when life is preparing us for something beautiful. And the courage to show our true face is the first step toward finding where we truly belong. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell me, have you ever been surprised by kindness when you expected cruelty? I read every single one. Hit that like button if you believe scars tell stories of survival, not shame. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that reminds you how strong you truly are. Share this with someone who needs to hear that their past does not have to be their future. From the ashes, we rise. The wind rolled across the Wyoming plains with a cold bite that October morning. It kicked up dust and sage, sweeping over the small town of Redemption Creek like a restless ghost. The sky stretched wide and endless above, pale blue fading into gray at the edges. Wooden buildings lined the dirt road like tired soldiers. The saloon, the general store, the auction house. Everything else felt like an afterthought. This was frontier country, hard land for hard people. Jacob Harlow stood on the porch of the Silver Dollar Saloon, his boots propped up on the railing. At 35 years old, he was one of the richest ranchers in the whole territory, owner of the Double H Ranch, a spread so large it swallowed miles of open land. His face carried the marks of a hard life. Sun-weathered skin, a jaw that looked carved from stone, but his gray eyes were sharp and steady. Men respected him. Women stayed clear of him. There was something unyielding in Jacob Harlow, something that made people keep their distance. He liked it that way. Tom Brennan, his foreman and oldest friend, stepped beside him. Tom was a stocky man with a graying beard and honest eyes. "Another auction today," Tom said, leaning against the railing. "Heard there is a new widow in the mix." Jacob took a slow drink from his glass. Whiskey. Good stuff. He needed it. He hated these auctions. Every fall, desperate widows lined up to be bid on by men looking for workers, cooks, or wives. It was a cruel tradition, a relic from harder times when survival meant doing whatever you had to do. Redemption Creek clung to it like a bad habit. "Who is she?" Jacob asked without much interest. Tom scratched his beard. "No one knows. Came in yesterday wrapped in black from head to toe. Folks are calling her the mystery widow." Jacob raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Inside the saloon, men laughed and shouted as they placed bets on who would win which woman. The sound made Jacob's stomach turn. He stayed where he was on the porch, telling himself the auction had nothing to do with him. He did not need a wife. He did not need trouble. And a woman wrapped in black from head to toe sounded like trouble. Across the street, Judge Morrison climbed onto the auction platform. He was a round man with a red face and a voice that carried. "Let us get this auction started," the judge yelled, banging his gavel against the wooden podium. Men hurried forward from the saloon, eager for a good spot. Jacob stayed on the porch, watching from a distance. He had no intention of bidding on anyone. The first women walked out onto the platform. Jacob knew them all. Sarah Mills, whose husband had died in a mining accident. Betty Donovan, left with 3 children and no money. Annie Peterson, barely 20 and already a widow. Hard lives had carved deep lines into their faces. They stood with their heads down, waiting to be claimed like cattle. Jacob looked away. This whole thing disgusted him. Then the final woman stepped out, the mystery widow. She did not hunch or tremble like the others. She walked with calm steps, her back straight, her chin level. A long black veil hid her face completely. Gloves covered her hands. Her whole body was wrapped in darkness, making her look like a statue carved from midnight. The crowd fell into a hush. Jacob found himself stepping off the porch. "Gentlemen," Judge Morrison began, clearing his throat. "The lady prefers privacy. She is educated and capable. She will share her name after arrangements are made." The whispers began immediately. "What is she hiding?" someone muttered. "Maybe she is sick. Ugly as sin, probably." Jacob felt something shift inside him. He did not know why, but he stepped forward through the crowd. Something about the way she stood pulled at him, proud yet fragile, steady yet trembling underneath. Judge Morrison lifted his gavel. "Shall we start the bidding at $20? Silence. The judge frowned. $10 then? Still, no one spoke. Jacob saw the mystery widow's gloved hands clench at her sides. She was nervous, scared, but she did not show it in her posture. She stood tall like a queen facing execution. Then a voice cut through the silence. "Hey, Harlow." Jacob turned. Buck Watson swaggered out of the saloon, grinning like a coyote. He was loud, drunk, and always looking for trouble. His two friends followed behind, already laughing at whatever cruel joke was coming. "I will bet you $100, Buck said, pointing at the mystery widow, "that you cannot get that crow to take off all that black by sunrise. You know, become your wife for real." The crowd erupted in laughter. Jacob's jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Buck smirked. "What is wrong, Harlow? Lost your charm? Everyone knows you have not touched a woman since Margaret died. Maybe you forgot how." The laughter grew louder. Jacob knew he should walk away. He knew Buck was baiting him. But something about the way the mystery widow stood there, alone and mocked, made his blood boil. Not for himself, for her. "Make it 300, Jacob said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Then I will take your bet." The crowd gasped. Buck's grin widened. He slapped his knee like this was the funniest thing he had ever heard. "Done." $300, says Jacob Harlow, cannot make that scarecrow his wife by sunrise. Jacob turned to the judge. $75. Judge Morrison perked up immediately. 75 from Mr. Harlow. Any higher? Ezra Blackwood stepped forward. He was a merchant with cold eyes and a reputation for cruelty to his workers. 100, Blackwood said. Jacob's eyes narrowed. 125. 150, Blackwood countered. 200. Jacob said it steady and calm, like money meant nothing to him, because compared to his pride, it did not. Blackwood froze. He looked at Jacob, then at the mystery widow, then back at Jacob. Finally, he stepped back. "She is all yours, Harlow." "Sold," the judge shouted, slamming his gavel, "to Jacob Harlow for $200. The mystery widow stood perfectly still as Jacob approached the platform. The crowd watched with greedy eyes, whispering about the bet, wondering what would happen next. Jacob climbed the steps slowly. Up close, he could see her hands trembling beneath those black gloves. He could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. He held out his hand. "Ma'am," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "let us get out of here." For a long moment she did not move. Then her gloved hand slipped into his. She trembled like a bird with a broken wing. "My name is Clara," she whispered. "Clara Thornton." Jacob helped her down from the platform. The crowd parted to let them pass, but the whispers followed like hungry wolves. $300 says he cannot do it. She must be hideous under that veil, poor fool. He just bought himself a nightmare. Jacob ignored them all. He led Clara to his wagon, helped her up onto the seat, and climbed up beside her. As he drove away from Redemption Creek, away from the hungry stares and cruel laughter, Jacob could not shake a strange feeling in his chest. He had just bought a woman wrapped in secrets, and something told him those secrets would change everything. The wagon wheels bumped along the rough ground as Jacob guided the horses across the open plains. The sun was sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of red and orange, like the whole world was on fire. Clara Thornton sat beside him, wrapped in her black veil and black dress. She held herself perfectly still, so still that Jacob wondered if she was even breathing. He cleared his throat. "You comfortable enough?" "Yes," Clara answered softly. Her voice was gentle, educated, not what he expected from a woman at an auction, though he could still hear the tremble beneath her words. They rode in silence for a long while. Jacob was not a man who felt the need to fill quiet with chatter, but this silence felt heavy, thick with questions neither of them was ready to ask. When the Double H Ranch came into view, Clara lifted her head. The spread stretched wide across the land. 2 large barns painted red, corrals filled with horses, bunkhouses for the ranch hands, and the main house standing tall against the prairie wind, white painted wood, a wide porch, windows that caught the dying sunlight like squares of gold. It was the kind of place most people dreamed of having. But Clara did not seem impressed. She did not gasp or comment on its size. She just stared at it with tired eyes behind that veil, like she had seen too much to be amazed by anything anymore. Maria, the housekeeper, stepped out onto the porch when the wagon stopped. She was a sturdy Mexican woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and kind eyes. She had worked for Jacob for 15 years, kept his house running, kept him fed when he forgot to eat. She was more family than employee. Her eyes widened when she saw Clara, wrapped up in black like someone attending her own funeral. "Maria," Jacob said, climbing down from the wagon. "Prepare the blue room. Mrs. Thornton will be staying with us." Maria nodded slowly. Her worry showed clear on her face, but she knew better than to question Jacob in front of a stranger. "Si, señor," she said. "Right away." Jacob helped Clara down from the wagon. Her hand was small in his, fragile, but her grip was firm. She followed Maria inside without a word, without looking back. Jacob watched her go, the weight of what he had done finally sinking in. He had bought a woman at auction. He had taken a drunk man's bet, and for the first time that whole day, shame burned in his chest like whiskey gone bad. He turned away from the house and let out a long breath. Tom Brennan approached from the barn, scratching his beard. "You sure about this, boss?" "No," Jacob said plainly, "but it is done." Inside the house, Clara moved like a shadow. Maria led her up the stairs and down a hallway decorated with landscape paintings and old photographs. The blue room was at the end, a corner room with 2 windows that looked out over the fields. The walls were painted a soft sky blue. A brass bed stood against one wall, covered in a quilt stitched with yellow flowers. There was a washstand with a porcelain basin, a wooden wardrobe, a rocking chair by the window. It was clean and warm, nicer than anywhere Clara had slept in months. Maria set down a pitcher of water and fresh towels. "I bring food soon," she said gently. "You rest now." "Thank you," Clara said, her voice barely above a whisper. Maria hesitated at the door. She wanted to say something, wanted to ask questions, but she just nodded and left, closing the door softly behind her. Clara stood alone in the blue room. She walked to the window and looked out at the land stretching toward the mountains. The sky was darkening now, stars beginning to appear. She pressed her gloved hand against the cold glass. "What have I done?" she whispered to herself. "What have I gotten myself into?" When Maria returned with a tray of food, Clara thanked her politely. Beef stew, fresh bread, a cup of hot tea. But she barely touched any of it. Downstairs, Jacob paced the hallway like a caged animal. He could not rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that crowd laughing, saw Buck Watson's ugly grin, saw the mystery widow standing alone on that platform while men mocked her. He heard footsteps above him. Clara walking back and forth in the blue room, wearing a path in the floorboards. She was nervous, frightened, maybe even regretting everything. Jacob ran a hand through his hair and cursed under his breath. What was he supposed to do now? He had bought her like property, made her part of a bet like she was a horse to be won or lost. The shame burned deeper. Maria appeared in the hallway, her arms crossed. "She is scared," Maria said. "That woman upstairs, she is scared like a rabbit in a trap." "I know," Jacob said. "What will you do?" Jacob did not answer, because he did not know. Maria shook her head and walked away, muttering prayers in Spanish. Hours passed. The house grew quiet. The ranch hands settled into the bunkhouse. The horses slept in the barn. But sometime after midnight, a soft knock came at Jacob's study door. He sat up fast from the chair where he had been dozing. "Come in," he said. The door opened slowly. Clara stepped inside, still wrapped in black, her veil still hiding her face, her hands still covered in those dark gloves. But something was different now. There was a set to her shoulders, a decision in her posture. "Mr. Harlow," she said quietly, "we must settle this matter." Jacob stood. "You do not have to do anything tonight. You can rest. We can talk tomorrow." "Please," she said, "let me speak." Her voice was steady now, stronger than before. Jacob nodded slowly. He gestured to a chair, but Clara shook her head. "I prefer to stand for this." "All right, then." Clara took a deep breath. Her gloved hands rose to her veil. Jacob felt his heart beat faster. He did not know what he expected, did not know what secrets that black fabric hid. She removed the heavy outer covering first, a thick black shawl that fell to the chair with a soft sound. Then she took out the pins that held the thin veil beneath. Her fingers trembled, but she did not stop. One pin, two, three. With the final pin gone, she pulled the veil away from her face. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. The scars were deep. They twisted across her left temple and down her scalp where the fire had stolen her hair. The skin was marked, raised, uneven, pink and white patches where healthy flesh had once been. But her eyes were gray like storm clouds before rain, sharp, alive, burning with a fire that no amount of scarring could extinguish. "This is what you paid for," Clara said quietly. "This is the face men turned away from, the face my old town feared and shunned." Jacob could not speak. Clara's chin lifted higher. "My husband's name was Thomas. We had a son named William. He was 7 years old." Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. "Railroad men came to our town 2 years ago. They wanted our land. Thomas refused to sell, so they burned us out in the middle of the night." Jacob felt his blood run cold. "My husband and son died in that fire. I survived, though God knows I sometimes wished I had not." She reached up and removed the wig she wore. Coarse black hair that fell away to reveal her scarred scalp beneath. Patches where hair would never grow again. She held it out like something dead. "The men who did this were never punished," Clara continued. "And when I refused to sell the land to them even after everything, the town turned against me. They called me cursed. Said God had marked me for something sinful. I was no longer a wife, a mother, a neighbor. I was a monster." Tears glistened in her gray eyes, but she did not let them fall. "I left before they could destroy what was left of me. I came to Redemption Creek because I had nowhere else to go. And now here I am, standing in your house, part of your bet." She set the wig on the chair beside the veils. "Now you have the truth, Mr. Harlow. If you wish to collect your winnings, call Mr. Watson at sunrise. If not, I will return to the Blue Room and leave in the morning." Jacob stood frozen. The shock was not from her scars. It was from the courage it took for her to show them. The study was silent, except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Jacob stood across from Clara, his mind racing, his heart pounding in his chest. She waited for his response, her scarred face bare, her gray eyes steady despite the fear she must have felt. This woman had just stripped away every protection she had, every shield, every mask, and she stood before him like a soldier awaiting judgment. Jacob finally found his voice. "Clara," he said slowly, "sit with me a moment." "I prefer to stand," she said. "Then I will stand too." And he did. He stood there facing her, making sure she could see his eyes, making sure she knew he meant every word. "You listen to me," Jacob said, his voice low but firm. "I will not be calling Buck Watson, and I will not claim that bet." Clara frowned. Her hands tightened at her sides. "Why not?" "Because what happened to you was evil," Jacob said. "Not shameful. The shame belongs to the men who hurt you. The shame belongs to that town that cast you out. The shame belongs to anyone who made you believe your scars made you less." He stepped closer. "But it does not belong to you, Clara. None of it." Silence stretched between them. The clock ticked, the fire crackled in the hearth. Clara blinked hard. For the first time that night, her composure cracked. "I do not understand you," she whispered. "Maybe I do not understand myself," Jacob admitted. "But I know this much. You do not have to hide here. Not from me. Not in my home." Clara's breath caught. She looked at him like he was speaking a language she had forgotten. "Mr. Harlow," she began. "Jacob," he corrected. "Just Jacob." She swallowed hard. "Jacob. I came here expecting cruelty, expecting to be used and discarded. That is what happens to women like me, women with nothing left." Jacob shook his head. "You are not nothing. Anyone who survives what you survived is stronger than most men I know. And any man who would treat you as less because of scars is not worthy of being called a man at all." The tears finally fell down Clara's cheeks, silent rivers cutting through the scarred and unmarked skin alike. She wiped them away quickly, ashamed of showing weakness. "I should return to my room," she murmured, reaching for her veils. "Leave them," Jacob said gently. Clara froze. "You do not need them here," he continued. "Not tonight, not ever. If you want to wear them in town, that is your choice. But in this house you are safe. You are not a monster. You are a guest. And I hope, in time, maybe a friend." Clara stared at him for a long moment. Then she pulled her hand back from the chair. "Good night," she whispered. "Jacob." It was the first time she had used his name. "Good night, Clara." She moved toward the door, then stopped with her hand on the frame. She did not turn around. "Thank you," she said quietly. "No one has spoken to me like that in a very long time." Then she slipped out into the hallway. Her footsteps faded up the stairs. Jacob stared at the veils and wig left on the chair. Those bits of black cloth had been her armor, her prison, her burden. And tonight, she had left them behind. Sleep did not come easily for Jacob that night. He lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, Clara's story playing over and over in his mind. A husband murdered, a child killed, a woman burned and broken by men who wanted nothing but her land, and then cast out by the very community that should have protected her. Jacob knew evil existed in the world. He had seen his share of it during the war and in the hard years that followed. But there was something especially cruel about what had been done to Clara. They had not just taken everything from her. They had made her believe she was worthless. That was the real crime. When morning came, Jacob was already dressed and downstairs when Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway. She wore a simple gray dress, no veils, no wig, her scarred face and patchy hair visible for the first time in daylight. Maria nearly dropped the pan she was holding, but the housekeeper recovered quickly. She smiled warmly and gestured to the table. "Sit, sit," Maria said. "I make you breakfast. You are too skinny." Clara hesitated. She looked at Jacob, clearly unsure. He pulled out a chair for her. "You heard the woman. Sit. Maria's cooking is the best in 3 counties. It would be a crime to refuse." A tiny smile touched Clara's lips. She sat. Maria served them eggs, bacon, biscuits with honey, and strong black coffee. Clara ate slowly at first, then with more appetite as her stomach remembered what real food tasted like. Jacob watched her without staring. He noticed the way she held her fork, elegant, practiced, the way she dabbed her napkin to her lips, small gestures that spoke of education and breeding. Whoever Clara Thornton had been before the fire, she had not been a common farm wife. After breakfast, Jacob stood. "I have work to do in the north pasture," he said. "Tom will show you around the ranch if you would like, or you can rest, whatever suits you." Clara set down her coffee cup. "I would rather be useful," she said, "if you will let me." Maria's eyes lit up. "You can help me in the garden," she said quickly. "The vegetables need harvesting before the frost comes." Clara nodded. "I would like that." And just like that, she had a place. Word spread through Redemption Creek faster than wildfire. Jacob Harlow had taken the mystery widow home. But he had not claimed the bet, had not tried to force himself on her, had not sent her away in shame. Instead, she was living at the Double H Ranch, working alongside the housekeeper, showing her face openly despite the scars. Buck Watson was furious. He stormed into the Silver Dollar Saloon that afternoon, red-faced and drunk. "That snake owes me $300, Buck shouted. "The bet was by sunrise." "He did not do it," the bartender shrugged. "Maybe he decided the bet was not worth it." "Not worth it?" Buck slammed his fist on the bar. "I will make him pay, one way or another." But for now, Buck could do nothing. Jacob Harlow was too powerful, too respected. Picking a fight with him openly would be suicide. So Buck waited, and plotted, and nursed his hatred like a wound that would not heal. Days turned into weeks at the Double H Ranch. Clara found a rhythm. She helped Maria with cooking and cleaning. She worked in the garden, turning soil, pulling weeds, harvesting the last of the autumn vegetables. The ranch hands kept their distance at first, unsure what to make of the scarred woman in their midst. But Clara never complained, never demanded special treatment. She worked as hard as anyone and asked for nothing in return. Old Pete, the oldest ranch hand on the Double H, was the first to warm up to her. He found her one afternoon repairing a fence post that had come loose. "You know how to fix fences?" Pete asked, surprised. Clara wiped sweat from her brow. "My father taught me. He believed a woman should know how to take care of herself." Pete grinned. He had lost most of his teeth, but his smile was still warm. "Smart man, your father. Most folks around here think women are only good for cooking and making babies." Clara smiled back. "Most folks around here are wrong." From that day on, Pete made sure the other ranch hands treated Clara with respect. "Anyone gives you trouble," Pete told her, "you come to me. I may be old, but I can still throw a punch." Clara laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in longer than she could remember. The sound carried across the yard. Jacob heard it from the porch where he stood watching, and for the first time in years, he felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been frozen solid since Margaret died. 3 weeks had passed since Clara arrived at the Double H Ranch. The autumn had deepened into early winter. Frost painted the fields white each morning. The mountains wore caps of snow that crept lower with each passing day. Clara had found a peace she never expected. Working the land, helping Maria, learning the rhythms of ranch life. But peace, as she had learned, never lasted. It was a Thursday morning when the strangers rode into Redemption Creek. Clara had gone into town with Maria to buy supplies at the general store. She wore a simple bonnet now instead of her heavy veils. Some people still stared at her scars, but most had grown used to seeing her. She was loading flour into the wagon when she heard the horses. 3 riders coming down the main road, city men by the look of them. Fine coats and polished boots that had no place on the frontier. Clara's blood turned to ice. She knew those faces. The leader was a tall man with silver hair and cold blue eyes. Harrison Cole, the railroad baron who had ordered her family killed. Beside him rode 2 younger men, his sons Marcus and Devon. They had the same cruel eyes as their father. Clara dropped the bag of flour. Maria caught her arm. "Senora, what is wrong?" Clara could not speak, could not breathe. They had found her. After 2 years of running, 2 years of hiding, the men who destroyed her life had finally tracked her down. She ducked behind the wagon, pulling her bonnet low over her face. "Maria," she whispered urgently, "we must go. Now." But Maria was confused. She did not understand the danger. "The supplies," Maria said. "We are not finished. Leave them." Clara's voice shook. "Please, Maria, I will explain later. But we must leave right now." Something in Clara's tone made Maria obey. They climbed into the wagon and drove out of town as quickly as they could without drawing attention. Clara did not look back, but she felt Harrison Cole's eyes sweep across the street. Searching. Hunting. Back at the ranch, Clara told Jacob everything. They sat in his study, the door closed, the fire burning low. Clara's hands trembled as she spoke. "Harrison Cole is one of the most powerful men in the railroad business," she explained. "He wanted my husband's land because it sat on the route he planned for a new line. Thomas refused to sell. He said the land had been in his family for 3 generations. He would not give it up for any amount of money." Jacob listened in silence, his jaw tight, his eyes hard. "Cole does not accept refusal," Clara continued. "When Thomas threatened to go to the authorities about some of Cole's illegal dealings, Cole decided to silence him permanently." "The fire," Jacob said quietly. Clara nodded. "They waited until we were asleep, blocked the doors, lit the house from all sides." Her voice broke. "William woke up first. He was screaming for me. I tried to reach him, but the flames were everywhere. Thomas pushed me out a window, told me to run. That was the last time I saw them alive." Tears streamed down her face, but she kept talking. "The official report called it an accident. A lantern knocked over. No one was charged. No one was held responsible." Jacob's hands curled into fists. "And the scars?" he asked. Clara touched her temple. "Burning timber fell on me as I escaped. The doctors said I was lucky to survive, but survival felt more like a curse than a blessing for a long time." She wiped her eyes. "After the fire, I refused to sell the land. It was all I had left of them. Cole tried to pressure me, threaten me, but I held firm. So he turned the town against me instead. Made sure everyone knew about my scars. Called me cursed and crazy. Eventually, I had no choice but to leave. And now he has found you," Jacob said. Clara nodded miserably. "I should go. If I stay here, I will bring danger to your ranch, to your people. Cole will not stop until he has what he wants." Jacob stood abruptly. "You are not going anywhere." "But Jacob—" "No." He moved to stand before her, his gray eyes fierce. "You have run long enough, Clara. You have hidden long enough. This is your home now, and I will not let some railroad vulture drive you away." Clara stared at him. "You do not know what you are saying. Cole has money, power, connections. He could destroy everything you have built. Then let him try." Jacob's voice was hard as iron. "But I will not surrender, and neither will you. Not anymore." Something shifted in Clara's chest. No one had ever stood up for her like this. No one had ever fought for her. She reached out and took Jacob's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Jacob squeezed her fingers gently. "Thank me after we win." That night, Jacob called a meeting in the main house. Tom Brennan came. Old Pete, the other senior ranch hands. Even Maria sat in the corner, her rosary beads clicking softly. Jacob told them about Harrison Cole, about the fire that killed Clara's family, about the threat that had followed her to Redemption Creek. When he finished, silence filled the room. Then Pete spoke up. "So some fancy railroad man thinks he can come to our town and hurt our people?" "Our people." Clara's heart swelled. Tom cracked his knuckles. "I have been looking for a good fight. One by one, the others nodded. "We stand with you, boss," they said, "and we stand with Mrs. Thornton." Clara blinked back tears. She had spent 2 years believing she was alone, believing no one would ever care what happened to her. She had been wrong. Harrison Cole wasted no time. The very next day, a formal letter arrived at the Double H Ranch, hand-delivered by a lawyer in a fancy suit. Jacob read it aloud in the study. "Dear Mr. Harlow, it has come to my attention that you are harboring a woman named Clara Thornton. Mrs. Thornton owes a considerable debt to the Coal Railroad Company. I hereby demand that she be surrendered into my custody to settle this matter." Jacob crumpled the letter and threw it into the fire. "His custody," Clara said bitterly. "He means to kill me. Make it look like an accident, just like Thomas and William. That is not going to happen." Jacob walked to his gun cabinet and unlocked it. "From now on, you do not go anywhere alone. Tom will assign men to watch the property. And if Cole or his sons set foot on my land, they will regret it." Clara watched him prepare for war. She should have felt afraid. Instead, she felt something she had not felt in years: hope. Harrison Cole did not like being ignored. When Jacob Harlow burned his letter without response, Cole took it as a personal insult. No one had defied him in 20 years. Not successfully, anyway. He sat in the finest room the Redemption Creek Hotel could offer, which was not very fine at all. His sons Marcus and Devin lounged nearby, drinking whiskey and complaining about the dust. "This town is pathetic," Marcus sneered. "How can anyone live out here?" Devin shrugged. "Does not matter. We get the woman, we leave. Simple." Harrison Cole looked out the window at the dusty street below. "It should be simple," he agreed. "But this rancher Harlow is proving stubborn. So we make him unstubborn," Marcus said with an ugly grin. "A few accidents on his ranch. Some cattle gone missing. Maybe a barn burned down. He will hand over the widow quick enough." Cole considered this. It had worked before. Fear was a reliable tool when properly applied. But something about Jacob Harlow gave him pause. The man had a reputation: honest, tough, not the kind to scare easy. They would need to be clever about this. "Hire some locals," Cole decided. "Men who know the area, men who cannot be traced back to us." Devin nodded eagerly. "I know just the type," he said. "Saw them in that saloon last night. Real rough characters." "Perfect," Cole said. "Start small. Let Harlow know we are serious. If he still refuses..." He left the threat unfinished. Some things did not need to be spoken aloud. Back at the Double H Ranch, Clara threw herself into preparing for the fight ahead. She could not shoot well, but she could reload, could tend wounds if needed, could help Maria store supplies in case of a siege. The ranch transformed quietly. More men patrolled the borders. Weapons were cleaned and kept ready. Everyone moved with purpose and vigilance. Jacob watched Clara work one afternoon. She was in the barn organizing medical supplies with focused determination. "You do not have to do all this," he said from the doorway. Clara did not look up. "Yes, I do. These people are risking everything because of me. The least I can do is be useful." Jacob walked closer. "They are not risking anything because of you. They are standing against evil. There is a difference." Clara finally met his eyes. "Is there?" "Yes." Jacob's voice was firm. "Cole is the threat, not you. You did not ask for any of this. You just refused to let evil men take what was yours. There is no shame in that." Clara set down the bandages she was sorting. "Sometimes I wonder," she said quietly, "if I had just sold the land, just given them what they wanted, Thomas and William might still be alive." Jacob stepped forward, and Cole would have gone on to destroy the next family that stood in his way. Men like him do not stop until someone stops them. Clara looked at him, really looked. She saw the strength in his face, the conviction, the stubborn determination that refused to bend. "You truly believe we can win," she said, "against someone like Harrison Cole?" "I believe we have to try," Jacob replied. "Some things are worth fighting for, even if the odds are bad." Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. She had spent so long being afraid, so long hiding and running, but standing here with Jacob, she felt something else growing. Courage. The first attack came 3 nights later. Someone set fire to the hay barn on the east side of the property. The flames lit up the night sky before anyone realized what was happening. Jacob organized the men quickly. They formed a bucket line from the well, fighting the blaze while others stood guard against further attacks. Clara worked alongside them, hauling water until her arms burned, beating back sparks with wet blankets. By dawn, the barn was destroyed, but the horses and cattle had been saved. The ranch hands gathered in the yard, covered in soot and sweat. "This was Cole," Tom said grimly. "Has to be," Jacob nodded. "He expected us to panic. Run scared. Instead, we saved what mattered," old Pete added. Clara looked at the smoking ruins of the barn. "He will try again," she said. "Something worse next time." "Then we will be ready," Jacob replied. But Cole's next move was not what anyone expected. 2 days after the fire, Sheriff Williams rode out to the Double H Ranch. He was a nervous man who owed his position more to politics than courage. "Mr. Harlow," the sheriff said, not meeting Jacob's eyes, "I have been asked to inform you that there is a warrant for Mrs. Thornton's arrest." Jacob went very still. "A warrant? On what grounds?" The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Murder. The warrant claims she killed her husband and son, started the fire that took their lives." Clara felt the world tilt beneath her feet. "That is a lie," she breathed. "I would never. They were my family. I loved them." Sheriff Williams held up his hands. "I am just delivering the message. The warrant comes from back east, signed by a judge in Thomas Thornton's home county. A judge paid off by Cole," Jacob said coldly. The sheriff did not deny it. "I have 3 days to execute the warrant," he said quietly. "After that, marshals will be sent. Federal men. This will get ugly if Mrs. Thornton does not surrender." "She is not surrendering to anyone," Jacob said. "Mr. Harlow." "Get off my property, Sheriff." Jacob's voice was low and dangerous. "And tell Cole that if he wants Clara, he will have to come through me first." Sheriff Williams retreated quickly. His horse kicked up dust as he fled down the road. Clara was shaking. "Murder," she whispered. "They are calling me a murderer." Jacob pulled her into his arms without thinking. "They can call you whatever they want. It does not make it true." Clara pressed her face against his chest, felt his heart beating steady and strong. "3 days," she said. "Then we have 3 days to prove the truth," Jacob replied. "And we will. I promise." He held her tighter. And Clara, for the first time since the fire, let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. 3 days. That was all the time they had to prove Clara's innocence before federal marshals arrived to take her away. Jacob did not waste a single moment. He sent Tom Brennan to the telegraph office in town. Messages flew across the wires to lawyers, journalists, anyone who might help. Meanwhile, Jacob sat with Clara in his study, going over every detail of the night her family died. "Tell me everything," he said. "No matter how small. Something in your memory might be the key." Clara closed her eyes. Returning to that night was torture, but she forced herself to remember. "It was late," she began. "Past midnight. Thomas had been worried for weeks. He knew Cole was dangerous. We had talked about leaving, starting over somewhere else. But Thomas believed in fighting for what was right." Jacob nodded. "Go on." "I woke to smoke. The house was already burning. Thomas grabbed William, told me to get out the back. But the back door was blocked. They had piled wood against it." Clara's voice shook. "I ran to find another way. Thomas tried to break through the front. The roof collapsed before he could reach me. I barely made it out a window." "And the men who started the fire?" "I saw 3 of them," Clara said. "Riding away?" One of them looked back at the house. He was laughing. Jacob leaned forward. "Would you recognize him?" Clara hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes. I will never forget his face." The next morning, a response came by telegraph. It was from a journalist named Samuel Reed in St. Louis. He had been investigating Cole's railroad for years, documenting bribery, intimidation, and worse. His message was simple. I have evidence. Come quickly. Jacob made the decision instantly. I am going to St. Louis. Clara grabbed his arm. That is 3 days by train. You will not make it back in time. I will if I ride to the junction and catch the express, Jacob said. Tom will stay here. Keep you safe until I return. But Jacob, this is our only chance, Clara. If Reed has proof of Cole's crimes, we can clear your name and bring Cole to justice. Clara looked into his gray eyes. She saw determination there, and something else, something that made her heart ache. Come back to me, she whispered. Please. Jacob took her hand and pressed it to his lips. I will, I promise. Jacob rode hard through the day and into the night. He reached the railroad junction with barely an hour to spare before the express departed. His horse was lathered and exhausted, but he had made it. The train journey felt endless. Jacob sat in his compartment watching the countryside blur past. Farmland gave way to towns, then cities. The world beyond Wyoming was crowded and noisy. But all Jacob could think about was Clara. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped being just a woman he had saved from an auction. She had become something more, someone who mattered, someone he could not bear to lose. Samuel Reed was a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He met Jacob at the St. Louis station looking nervous. You took a risk coming here, Mr. Harlow, Reed said. Cole has eyes everywhere. I take bigger risks every day, Jacob replied. Do you have the evidence or not? Reed led him to a small apartment filled with stacks of papers and files. I have been building this case for 5 years, the journalist explained. Cole has bribed judges, threatened witnesses, arranged accidents. 23 people have died standing in his way. Jacob felt cold. 23, at least. Reed pulled out a thick folder. But here is what will interest you most. He opened the folder to reveal a collection of letters. Correspondence between Cole and his hired men. This one, Reed said, points to a letter dated 2 years earlier. Details payment for services rendered in removing Thomas Thornton and his family from their property. Jacob read the letter, then read it again. It was all there. The plan, the payment, the names of the men Cole hired to start the fire. This proves Clara is innocent, Jacob said. It proves more than that, Reed replied. It proves Cole is guilty of murder. But getting the evidence back to Wyoming would not be easy. Cole has men watching the trains, Reed warned. If they see you carrying this folder, they will kill you. Then I will have to make sure they do not see it. Jacob thought quickly. Can you make copies of these documents? Reed nodded. I already have copies hidden in 3 different locations, in case anything happens to me. Good. Jacob handed back the folder. Send 1 copy to the federal marshal's office. Send another to the biggest newspaper in New York. Keep the originals safe. What about you? Jacob pulled out a single letter from the folder, the one that named Cole directly. This one comes with me. If Cole's men want it, they will have to take it from my dead body. Reed looked at him with something like admiration. You really love her, do you not? This Clara woman. Jacob paused. The question caught him off guard, but the answer came easily. Yes, he said. I do. The return journey was tense. Jacob kept the letter hidden inside his boot. He watched every passenger who entered his train car, slept with one hand on his pistol. At one of the stops, 2 men in city suits boarded. They had the look of hired thugs dressed up fancy. Jacob moved to a different car, then another. For 2 days, he played cat and mouse across the moving train, always staying 1 step ahead. When the train finally reached Wyoming, Jacob was exhausted. But he was alive, and the letter was safe. Tom met him at the station with fresh horses. How is Clara? Jacob asked immediately. Safe for now. But the marshals arrived this morning. Sheriff Williams is stalling, but he cannot hold them off much longer. Then we have no time to lose. They rode hard for Redemption Creek. The sun was setting behind the mountains when the town came into view. Jacob did not slow down. He rode straight to the courthouse where the marshals waited. Clara stood on the steps in chains. Her face was pale, but her chin was high. Harrison Cole stood nearby, smiling like a snake. "Ah, Mr. Harlow," Cole said smoothly. "You are just in time to see justice served." Jacob dismounted and walked toward them. "Justice," he said, pulling the letter from his boot. "Let me show you justice." He held up the letter for everyone to see. This is Cole's own words, his own handwriting, ordering the murder of Thomas Thornton and his family. The crowd gasped. Cole's smile vanished. "That is a forgery," he sputtered. The federal marshal took the letter and read it carefully. His face grew darker with each line. "Mr. Cole," the marshal said slowly, "I think you had better come with me." "This is absurd," Cole shouted. "I am Harrison Cole. I own half the railroads in this country. And you ordered the murder of innocent people," Jacob replied. "Your money cannot buy your way out of that." The marshals moved toward Cole. His sons tried to run but were quickly caught. Clara watched in disbelief as the men who destroyed her life were led away in chains, the same chains that had been meant for her. Jacob walked to her and took her hands. "It is over," he said softly. "You are free." Tears streamed down Clara's scarred face. "How can I ever thank you?" Jacob smiled. "Marry me." "That would be a good start." Clara laughed through her tears. "Is that a proposal?" "It is, if you will have me." She answered by throwing her arms around his neck and kissing him in front of the whole town. The crowd erupted in cheers. And somewhere in the chaos, Clara Thornton finally let go of the past and embraced her future. The weeks following Harrison Cole's arrest were filled with change. The newspapers picked up the story. A powerful railroad baron brought down by a scarred widow and a stubborn rancher. It spread across the country like wildfire. Letters arrived at the Double H Ranch from strangers all over. People who had been hurt by Cole. Families who had lost everything to his greed. They wrote to thank Clara for her courage. She read every letter and cried over many of them. "So much pain," Clara said one evening, holding a letter from a woman in Ohio whose husband had been killed by Cole's men. "So many lives destroyed." Jacob sat beside her on the porch swing. "But it stops now. Cole will hang for what he did. His sons will spend their lives in prison. No more families will suffer because of them." Clara nodded slowly, but she could not shake the weight that pressed on her heart. "All those years I spent hiding," she whispered. "All those years I thought I was alone. But there were so many others just like me." Jacob took her hand. "You could not have known. And you could not have stopped him alone. But you started something, Clara. Your courage inspired people to finally speak up." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I do not feel very courageous." Jacob smiled softly. "The bravest people rarely do." As winter settled over Wyoming, the ranch quieted into a peaceful rhythm. Clara spent her days helping Maria with the house, cooking meals that grew more confident with each attempt, learning to preserve vegetables and cure meat for the cold months ahead. She also started spending time with the ranch hands. Old Pete taught her to ride properly. Tom showed her how to read cattle tracks and predict weather by the clouds. She was becoming part of the ranch, part of the family. One afternoon, Maria caught Clara staring at her reflection in a window. "What are you looking at, Senora?" Maria asked. Clara touched her scarred temple. "I was just thinking," she said quietly. "I spent so long hiding this face. Believing it made me ugly, unlovable." Maria tisked and shook her head. "Beauty is not just skin. Beauty is in the soul. And your soul is very beautiful, Senora. Anyone can see that." Clara smiled. "Jacob says something similar." Maria's eyes twinkled. "El Patron is a smart man. You should listen to him." Clara laughed. It was becoming easier to laugh now, easier to breathe. The weight she had carried for so long was slowly lifting. That night, Jacob asked Clara to walk with him. They bundled up against the cold and set out across the snow-covered fields. The moon was full, casting silver light across the white landscape. For a while they walked in comfortable silence. Then Jacob stopped at the top of a small hill that overlooked the ranch. "I want to show you something," he said. Clara looked where he pointed. Below them, the double H stretched out, peaceful and still. Smoke rose from chimneys. Lights glowed in windows. "This is what I see when I think about the future," Jacob said. "This ranch, this land. But it always felt empty somehow, like something was missing." Clara's heart beat faster. "And now?" she asked. Jacob turned to face her. "Now, when I picture the future, you are in it, standing beside me, building a life together." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "Jacob," she began. He held up his hand. "I know what you're going to say. You think you are damaged, broken, that you cannot give me the life a man like me deserves." Clara looked down. "I have thought those things," she admitted. Jacob gently lifted her chin. "Then stop. Because the only thing I need for a good life is standing right in front of me." He pulled a ring from his pocket. Simple gold with a blue stone that matched the sky. "Clara Thornton. I know I proposed once before, in front of the whole town in the middle of chaos. But you deserve a proper proposal, just you and me, under the stars." Clara's breath caught. "Will you marry me?" Jacob asked. "Will you be my wife, my partner, the person I wake up next to every morning and fall asleep beside every night?" The tears fell freely now. "Yes," Clara whispered. "Yes, Jacob. 1,000 times yes." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. Then he kissed her. Gentle at first, then deeper. A kiss that held all the promises of the future they would build together. When they finally pulled apart, Clara was shaking. "I love you," she said. "I did not think I could ever love anyone again after Thomas. But you showed me that my heart was not as broken as I believed." Jacob pulled her close. "And I love you, Clara. Scars and all. Forever." They stood on that hill beneath the stars, holding each other, while the snow fell softly around them. Two broken people finding wholeness in each other. The wedding was set for spring. But winter on the ranch brought its own kind of magic. Clara and Jacob spent long evenings by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, learning each other's stories, dreams, and fears. She told him about William, how he loved to chase butterflies, how he would climb into her lap and beg for stories, how his laughter was the brightest sound she had ever heard. Jacob held her while she cried. Then he told her about Margaret, his first wife who died of fever 3 years earlier, how he had closed off his heart after losing her, told himself he would never love again. "But you changed that," he said. "You broke through walls I did not even know I had built." Clara kissed his forehead. "We are quite a pair," she said softly, "two people who thought they were finished with love." "And here we are," Jacob agreed, "starting again." "Maybe that is what love does," Clara said. "It gives us the courage to start again, no matter how many times we fall." Jacob smiled. "Look at you, getting philosophical," Clara laughed. "You bring out the poet in me, Mr. Harlow." "Is that so, Mrs. Soon-to-be Harlow?" She kissed him again. "That is very much so." As winter faded and spring crept across the Wyoming plains, Redemption Creek transformed along with the seasons. The trial of Harrison Cole had brought attention to the small town. Journalists came to write stories about the scarred widow who brought down a railroad baron. Some of that attention faded with time, but what remained was something more valuable: a sense of purpose. The women of Redemption Creek, many of whom had been sold at auctions themselves, began meeting weekly at the church. Clara attended every gathering. At first she just listened, but gradually she began to share her story. The fire, the scars, the years of hiding. The moment she decided to stop running and start fighting. Her words gave other women courage. Sarah Mills, the widow who had stood on the auction platform beside Clara that first day, spoke up about her own struggles. How she had been treated as property rather than a person. How she had dreamed of something better but never believed it was possible. One by one, the women shared their stories, and from those stories, an idea was born. "What if we changed the auction?" Sarah asked one afternoon. "Made it something different?" Clara leaned forward, interested. "What do you mean?" "What if instead of selling ourselves, we offered our skills?" Sarah's eyes were bright. "Cooking, sewing, teaching, nursing. Women here have talents worth paying for. We could start businesses, support ourselves." The room buzzed with excited whispers. Clara smiled. "I think that is a wonderful idea." Jacob supported the plan completely. He donated lumber from his ranch to help build a new community hall, a place where women could sell their goods, offer services, and meet without being under the watchful eye of the saloon. Tom Brennan organized the ranch hands to do the construction. Old Pete insisted on carving the sign himself. "Redemption Ladies' Hall," it read. "All are welcome." The hall opened on the first warm day of spring. Clara stood at the entrance, watching women and men stream inside. Tables displayed quilts, baked goods, preserves, and handmade clothing. In one corner, Betty Donovan taught a sewing class to young girls. In another, Annie Peterson offered reading lessons for children whose families could not afford schooling. Maria had set up a table selling her famous tamales. The line stretched out the door. Jacob came to stand beside Clara. "You did this," he said quietly. Clara shook her head. "We all did this, together. But it started with you, your courage, your willingness to stop hiding and start living." Clara looked out at the bustling hall. "I spent so long believing my scars made me worthless," she said, "but now I understand. They remind me of what I survived, and survival is nothing to be ashamed of." Jacob took her hand. "No," he agreed. "It is something to celebrate." But not everyone in Redemption Creek was happy with the changes. Buck Watson had nursed his grudge through the long winter. He had lost his bet with Jacob, lost face in front of the whole town. And now he had to watch the scarred widow become some kind of hero. It made his blood boil. He gathered his friends in the back room of the saloon one night. "That woman ruined everything," Buck growled, "walking around like she owns the place. And Harlow treats her like a queen." One of his friends shrugged. "What can we do about it? Harlow has half the town on his side now." Buck's eyes narrowed. "Not half. Some folks still think the old ways were better. We just need to remind them." "What are you thinking?" Buck smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. "I am thinking we need to send a message. Something that shows everyone the mystery widow is not as powerful as she thinks." The message came 3 days before the wedding. Clara had gone to the community hall early that morning to help set up for a special celebration. The women were planning a gift-giving event where the whole town would bring offerings for the wedding. When Clara arrived, she found the front door broken open. Her heart dropped. Inside, the hall was destroyed. Tables overturned, quilts torn to shreds, jars of preserves smashed on the floor. The beautiful sign old Pete had carved was broken in two, the pieces thrown in the mud, and on the wall, painted in red, were words that cut like knives. "Cursed woman, go home." Clara stared at the destruction. For a moment, the old fear came flooding back, the shame, the urge to run and hide. But then something else rose up inside her. Anger. She had not survived fire, loss, and 2 years of running to be driven away by cowards who attacked in the dark. Clara Thornton was done being afraid. Jacob arrived within the hour, summoned by one of the ranch hands. His face went dark with fury when he saw the damage. "Who did this?" he demanded. Clara was already cleaning up, her movements steady and determined. "It does not matter who did it," she said. "What matters is what we do next." Jacob stared at her. "You want to let them get away with this?" "No," Clara said. "I want to show them they failed." She straightened up, meeting his eyes. "We rebuild," Today, before the wedding, we show whoever did this that they cannot break us. Jacob's anger slowly transformed into admiration. You are something else, Clara Thornton. She smiled. So I have been told. Word spread quickly through Redemption Creek. By noon, dozens of people had gathered at the damaged community hall. They brought hammers, nails, brooms, and fresh supplies. Sarah Mills arrived with a new quilt she had stayed up all night finishing. Old Pete brought wood to carve a new sign. Maria organized a crew of women to clean and cook, while the men repaired the structural damage. Even people who had been skeptical of Clara before came to help. The attack had crossed a line. Good people did not stand by when their neighbors were targeted. By sunset, the hall was restored. Better than restored, it was stronger. New reinforced doors, fresh paint, tables rebuilt with sturdier legs, and a new sign that Pete had outdone himself creating. Redemption Ladies' Hall, it read, with beautiful carved flowers around the letters, and underneath, smaller words that Clara had requested. From the ashes, we rise. Clara stood in front of the hall as the sun sank below the mountains. Jacob came to stand beside her. "Still want to marry me?" she asked. "Life with me seems to involve a lot of trouble." Jacob laughed. "Sweetheart, trouble is my middle name." He pulled her close. "Besides, I have decided that any day with you is better than a lifetime without you. Trouble included." Clara leaned into his embrace. "2 more days," she whispered. "2 more days," he agreed. "Then you are stuck with me forever." "I cannot wait." Sheriff Williams did some actual investigating for once. By the next morning, he had arrested Buck Watson and 2 of his friends. The red paint on their hands and clothes was evidence enough. Buck tried to bluster his way out, but even his allies had turned against him. "Attacking women," one old-timer spat. "You are a disgrace to this town." Buck was sentenced to 6 months in the territorial prison. His friends got 3 months each. When Clara heard the news, she felt no satisfaction, only weariness. "Does it ever end?" she asked Jacob. "The hatred, the cruelty." Jacob was quiet for a moment. "Maybe not completely," he said finally. "There will always be people who fear what they do not understand, who lash out at change. But there will also always be people willing to stand up for what is right, to protect the vulnerable, to rebuild what others destroy." Clara nodded slowly. "Like our town." "Like our town," Jacob agreed. "And like us." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Clara woke before sunrise, too excited and nervous to sleep any longer. She lay in bed, watching the sky lighten outside her window. Today, she would become Clara Harlow. Wife of Jacob, partner, lover, friend. It seemed impossible. Just 6 months ago, she had stood on an auction platform waiting to be bought like livestock, believing she would spend the rest of her life hiding from a world that despised her. Now she was about to marry a man who loved her, truly loved her, scars and all. Maria burst into the room with a tray of food. "Up, up," the housekeeper commanded cheerfully. "You must eat. Big day ahead." Clara sat up and accepted a cup of coffee gratefully. "I am nervous," she admitted. Maria patted her hand. "Every bride is nervous. But you are marrying a good man, the best man. Everything will be perfect." The wedding was held in Redemption Creek's small church. It was not fancy. Wooden pews worn smooth by years of use, plain glass windows, a simple altar decorated with wildflowers the women of the town had gathered. But to Clara, it was beautiful. She wore a dress the color of the Wyoming sky. Maria had sewn it with help from Sarah and the other women. Delicate embroidery decorated the bodice. The skirt was simple but elegant. Her hair was arranged carefully, the patches where it would never grow again woven through with tiny blue flowers. She wore no veil, no mask, no armor. For the first time, Clara Thornton faced the world exactly as she was. Old Pete walked her down the aisle. Her own father had died years ago, and Pete had become something like family. "You look beautiful," Pete whispered gruffly, "like an angel." Clara squeezed his arm. "Thank you for everything." Jacob waited at the altar, looking more nervous than Clara had ever seen him. He wore his best suit, dark wool that emphasized his broad shoulders and gray eyes. Tom stood beside him as best man, trying not to grin too widely. When Clara appeared in the doorway, Jacob's breath caught. She was radiant, not despite her scars, but including them. Every mark on her face told a story of survival, courage, and strength. He had never seen anything more beautiful. The ceremony was simple. The preacher spoke of love, commitment, and the mysterious ways God brings people together. He spoke of trials that test us and joys that reward us. Then came the vows. Clara faced Jacob, her gray eyes bright with unshed tears. "I, Clara Thornton, take you, Jacob Harlow, as my husband. I promise to love you through all seasons, through hardship and harvest, through storms and sunshine. I promise to stand beside you, not behind you, to face the world together, whatever it brings. I promise to be your partner, your confidant, your home, from this day forward until death parts us." Jacob's voice was thick when he replied, "I, Jacob Harlow, take you, Clara Thornton, as my wife. I promise to love you without condition or reservation, to protect you without stifling you, to cherish everything that makes you who you are, including the scars that tell the story of your survival. I promise to build a life with you, a home, a family, a future, from this day forward until death parts us." They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that matched her engagement ring. "By the power vested in me," the preacher announced, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride." Jacob pulled Clara close and kissed her softly. The church erupted in cheers and applause. Maria was sobbing happily into her handkerchief. Old Pete wiped his eyes with his sleeve. Even Tom looked a little misty. Clara laughed against Jacob's lips. "We did it," she whispered. "We did," he agreed. "And this is just the beginning." The reception was held at the Double H Ranch. Tables were set up in the yard, decorated with wildflowers and candles. Musicians played fiddles and guitars. Children ran between the adults, shrieking with joy. People came from all over the territory. Neighbors, business associates, even a few journalists who wanted to cover the happy ending to Clara's story. The food was endless. Maria had cooked for days, and every woman in Redemption Creek had contributed a dish. Roast beef, chicken, fresh bread, pies of every flavor, cakes stacked 3 tiers high. Clara danced until her feet ached. She danced with Jacob first, swaying together while the musicians played a slow waltz. Then Tom cut in, then Pete, then half the ranch hands who had become her friends. Even Sheriff Williams asked for a dance, apologizing again for his cowardice during the coal affair. "I should have stood up for you sooner," he said. "You are standing up now," Clara replied. "That is what matters." As the evening deepened, Clara and Jacob slipped away from the celebration for a quiet moment. They walked hand in hand to the hill overlooking the ranch, the same place where Jacob had proposed properly, under the winter stars. Now spring flowers carpeted the slope. The air was warm and sweet. "Happy?" Jacob asked. Clara looked out at the lights of the party below, at the ranch that had become her home, at the man who had become her everything. "More than I ever thought possible," she said. Jacob pulled her close. "I meant what I said in my vows," he told her quietly. "Every word. You are my partner, my equal. Whatever comes next, we face it together." Clara turned in his arms. "I know," she said, "and that is why I am not afraid anymore. Not of the past, not of the future, not of anything." She kissed him deeply. When they finally pulled apart, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "Welcome home, Clara Harlow." She smiled, her gray eyes shining. "Welcome home indeed." 1 year later, the Wyoming plains bloomed with summer wildflowers. Clara stood on the porch of the Double H Ranch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. Her hand rested on her swollen belly where new life grew. In 6 weeks, she would be a mother again. The thought still took her breath away. After William's death, Clara had believed she would never have another child, had believed she did not deserve another chance at motherhood, but life had surprised her, as it always did. Jacob came out of the house and wrapped his arms around her from behind. "How are my two favorite people?" he murmured against her hair. "We are perfect," Clara replied, leaning back into his embrace. The past year had been good to them. The Double H Ranch was thriving. They had expanded the herd, hired more hands, built a new barn to replace the one Cole's men had burned. Redemption Creek had transformed as well. The Ladies' Hall had become the heart of the community. Women ran businesses, taught school, served on committees. The old auction was a distant memory, replaced by an annual fair, where people came to trade and celebrate. Clara had started a program to help widows and abandoned women find work and housing. Sarah Mills helped run it, and they had assisted over 40 women in the past year alone. Harrison Cole had been convicted on multiple charges of murder and arson. He would spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His sons received 20 years each. Justice had been served. But more importantly, healing had begun. That evening, visitors arrived for dinner. Tom and his new wife, Rebecca, who he had married in spring. Old Pete, who had moved into the main house guest room because his joints could no longer handle the bunkhouse cots. Maria, who was family in every way that mattered. They gathered around the big dining table and shared food, laughter, and stories. Clara looked around at the faces of the people she loved. A year ago, she had been alone in the world, scarred, ashamed, and running from shadows. Now she had a husband who adored her, friends who would walk through fire for her, a community that had embraced her as one of their own, and a child on the way. Jacob caught her eye across the table and smiled. That smile still made her heart skip. "To family," Tom raised his glass. "To family," everyone echoed. After dinner, Clara and Jacob walked through the garden she had planted behind the house. Roses climbed trellises. Vegetables grew in neat rows. A small herb garden scented the air with lavender and rosemary. This garden represented everything Clara had rebuilt: beauty from ashes, life from destruction. "I have been thinking," she said as they walked. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About names. For the baby." They had discussed this before. If it was a boy, Jacob wanted to name him after his father. If it was a girl, Clara had suggested her mother's name. But now Clara had another idea. "If it is a girl," she said slowly, "I would like to call her Hope." Jacob stopped walking. "Hope," he repeated. Clara nodded. "Because that is what you gave me, what this ranch gave me, what Redemption Creek gave me. The chance to hope again when I thought hope was dead." Jacob's eyes glistened in the fading light. "Hope Harlow," he said softly. "I like it." Clara smiled. "And if it is a boy?" Jacob thought for a moment. "What about William?" Clara's breath caught. "William," she whispered. Jacob took her hands. "Your son deserved to grow up. He deserved a long and happy life. Naming our child after him would not be sad. It would be honoring his memory, keeping him alive in a new way." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. She had not expected this, had not expected Jacob to understand so perfectly. "You would do that?" she asked. Jacob kissed her forehead. "Clara, you are my wife. Your history is my history now. Your joys, your sorrows, your losses, they are all part of us. Of course I would honor your son's memory. He was part of you, and that makes him part of our family." Clara threw her arms around him and held on tight. "I love you," she sobbed into his shoulder. "I love you so much." "I know," Jacob murmured. "I love you too." 6 weeks later, on a warm August morning, Clara gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She had 10 fingers, 10 toes, and a set of lungs that could wake the whole ranch. Hope Harlow entered the world screaming. Clara thought it was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Jacob held the baby while Clara rested, his big, rough hands impossibly gentle with the tiny bundle. "She is perfect," he whispered. Clara smiled weakly. "She is ours." That autumn, Redemption Creek held its annual harvest fair. Clara walked through the festivities with Hope in her arms, accepting congratulations and warm wishes from neighbors. The town had changed so much since that first auction. Women laughed freely, children played safely, men worked alongside their wives as partners. It was not perfect. No place was. But it was home. Clara paused at the edge of the fair and looked back at her husband. Jacob stood talking with Tom and some of the other ranchers. The evening light caught his gray eyes and the silver beginning to show at his temples. He caught her looking and smiled. That smile still made her heart skip. Clara pressed a kiss to Hope's downy head. "Your father is a good man," she whispered to her daughter. "And you are going to have a wonderful life, full of love and laughter, and people who will stand by you no matter what." She looked up at the endless Wyoming sky. Somewhere beyond those stars, Thomas and William were watching. She believed that with her whole heart. "I made it," she told them silently. "I found my way through the fire. I found love again. I found hope. Thank you for believing in me, even when I could not believe in myself." A warm breeze swept across the plains, carrying the scent of sage and wildflowers. Clara smiled. Then she turned and walked back to her husband, her daughter in her arms, her future stretching bright and beautiful before her. From the ashes, she had risen, and she would never stop rising. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.